All right, diving in today, folks. We're tackling he, which translates to masked socializing. It's the title of Li Xuanyang's book, and it's a pretty insightful look at, well, how we all navigate this whole social interaction thing. Think of this deep dive as a sort of toolkit. We're going to pull out the most practical advice, the stuff that actually helps you build better connections, without burning yourself out in the process.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Li Xuanyang really does offer a practical um, framework, for understanding this stuff. And we're going to focus on four main sections of the book, which should give everyone a solid understanding of kind of the basics of social dynamics.
It's like, imagine we're looking at a map together, right? First, we're going to figure out why we sometimes feel so awkward or like hesitant in social situations, understanding things like social anxiety, shyness, those inner hurdles we all face. Then we'll chart a course for like actually expanding your social world, how to like make those first connections and reach out to people with more confidence.
After that, we'll navigate the terrain of building deeper relationships. That's where we'll talk about understanding what makes people tick, setting healthy boundaries, disagreeing productively, and how to really work well together as a team. And then finally, we'll look at how to manage your social connections so that they like support your goals and your well-being. Everything from how you present yourself to, recognizing when it's time to step back from a certain interaction.
So our mission for this deep dive is pretty simple. We're going to pull out all the key wisdom from Li Xuanyang's work, the stuff that will really help you navigate your social life with more clarity, identify what might be holding you back, and then ultimately, build those deeper connections we're all kind of looking for and do it without feeling like totally overwhelmed, right?
Yeah.
So let's get into it. And I think a great place to start is with something that I think affects a lot of us, social anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. Social anxiety, or what Li Xuanyang calls "hoyuch," can be a real roadblock when it comes to, putting yourself out there. And the book points to three main reasons why this feeling of, unease pops up in social situations.
Okay, so what are these three? What are like the core drivers of this social anxiety that he's identified?
Well, first off, there are things related to our own personality, our own psychology that can kind of set us up for this. The Xuanyang talks about two ways of thinking that often come up for people with social anxiety. One is this, it's almost like a deep-seated sense of self-inferiority.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, it's not just, feeling down on yourself every now and then. It's more of a consistent thing, this pattern of, like, labeling yourself negatively, doubting your abilities, believing that you can't change or improve, and then taking every setback, even the small ones, as proof that you're just a failure.
Right. Wow, that's a really, really tough inner battle to be constantly fighting. It's almost like an inner voice that's just constantly putting you down.
Exactly. And the second thought pattern is overthinking. People who struggle with social anxiety, they tend to have these really active minds, constantly going over and over different scenarios, and a lot of times scaring themselves with all these like negative possibilities about things that, I mean, haven't even happened and might not even happen, right? It's like this worry machine in their head that just won't switch off. And what the book stresses is that building self-confidence and getting yourself mentally ready for those certain social situations can really help to counter these tendencies.
Makes total sense. I mean, if you've already convinced yourself that things are going to go badly, it's going to be really hard to actually put yourself out there, right?
Yeah.
So what's the second major cause of social anxiety that Li Wanyang identifies?
Well, the second reason, he says, comes from having gone through those really negative experiences in social interactions. The kind of things that leave deep emotional wounds, and they can definitely lead to a fear of being in social situations again, right?
Yeah.
These examples of people who used to be really outgoing becoming much more reserved, and people who were already introverted sort of retreating even further after having a negative experience trying to connect with someone. It's like, I mean, think about it. If you touch a hot stove once, you're going to be really careful around stoves from then on.
Yeah, for sure. One bad experience can really shape how you approach, all kinds of similar situations, especially in the future. So what's the third piece of the puzzle here? What's the third reason?
All right. The third reason is, it's interesting. He talks about two different types of what he calls social fear. The first one is feeling okay around strangers, but then getting super anxious around people you know really well. And this often comes from a fear of being like seen through by the people who know you know your past. There's that worry that you might reveal your vulnerabilities or, those past mistakes that you'd rather not talk about. He even gives an example of the actor Huang Lei, who he reportedly feels less comfortable actually meeting up with his old friends because, they know his background, and that can create this kind of awkwardness.
Oh, wow. That's such an interesting point, right? Like it's easier to present a certain image to strangers because there's no shared history there. But with people who know you, there's this whole backstory that kind of comes into play. So what's the other type of social fear? You said there were two, right?
Right. So the second type is kind of the opposite. It's feeling comfortable with the people you already know, but then getting anxious when you have to interact with strangers. These folks, they find comfort in their existing relationships, right? But the idea of like making new connections, it feels tiring. And often they just don't feel like they have the skills to do it. It's like, imagine being a star player on your home team, but then you have to play on an unfamiliar field. You just feel totally out of your element. Right, right. That makes sense. So we've got these different origins of social anxiety. That's kind of the first step, understanding where it comes from. But how do we actually start to overcome it? What are some of the tips that Li Xuanyang offers? Well, he suggests a few different strategies, and one of the main ones is consciously working to change those negative thought patterns that we were talking about earlier. So, instead of constantly putting yourself down, it's about actively affirming your worth. And a practical tip he gives is to actually sit down and make a list of 5 to 10 things that you're good at. And it don't have to be huge, monumental things, It could be that you're a good listener, or you know a lot about a certain hobby, or you're a really reliable friend. Building self-confidence, it often starts with just recognizing those positive qualities that you already have. He also suggests exploring new interests. It's a way to gain more things to talk about, and that can naturally boost your confidence too.
Yeah, I really like that. It's about building that foundation of self-belief, but doing it through like small, tangible actions, right? So what's the second mental shift, that we should be aiming for?
The second one is moving away from that constant overthinking and instead trying to identify your core beliefs and develop a stronger sense of resilience. The book really emphasizes the connection between your inner beliefs and your self-confidence, like truly believing in your own value. That's really fundamental for overcoming social anxiety.
So it's about like anchoring yourself in a more positive sense of self-worth.
Exactly.
Okay. And besides these changes in how we think, what other strategies does Li Xuanyang recommend for dealing with this social anxiety?
Well, besides what's going on in your head, he also talks about the importance of developing your communication and social skills. I mean, just through practice, right?
Yeah.
And this is interesting. He also suggests that we learn not to get too caught up in those physical signs of anxiety, like your heart racing or your palms sweating. It's about recognizing that those are just temporary physical responses and not necessarily a sign that you're going to fail socially.
Yeah.
And that can be surprisingly empowering.
It's true. It's like separating the feeling from the reality of the situation, right?
Right.
Okay, so we've looked at what can cause social anxiety and a few ways to manage it. Now, Li Xuanyang also discusses this interesting phenomenon. He calls it social invisibility. It's that feeling of being unseen or like overlooked in social situations. What's going on there?
Yeah, social invisibility. It's that awkward feeling where, you kind of wish you could just blend into the background, or you feel totally exposed when you're noticed. I think a lot of people can relate to that, actually. Have you ever felt that way?
Oh, absolutely. I think most of us have had those moments where we feel like we're just fading into the wallpaper at a party or something. So what does Li Xuanyang say about this? What causes that feeling?
Well, he points to two main reasons. One is excessive self-awareness. In Chinese, it's share. And that's when, you feel like everyone is watching you constantly. Like every little thing you say or do, even how you look, is being judged. You get so focused on these tiny details about yourself that it creates a lot of pressure, internal pressure, right? And that easily leads to feeling awkward and self-conscious.
It's like there's a spotlight on you, even when you don't want it there.
Exactly.
So what's the second reason for feeling socially invisible?
Okay, the second reason is something called attention bias. And this is the tendency to like zero in on yourself,
Yeah.
your own thoughts, your own feelings, even your own potential mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't pay enough attention to the other people who are like right there in the interaction with you or the flow of the conversation. You're so wrapped up in your own head that you kind of miss what's happening externally.
Right. You're in your own little world.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with this? How do we address this feeling?
He offers a couple of methods. So one is about, trying to dial down that excessive self-awareness. And the key here is to shift your attention outward, focus on the task at hand or the specific purpose of like why you're in that social interaction. So for example, let's say you're at a huge conference, right? Instead of getting all hung up on whether you're, making a great impression on absolutely everyone, you could set a smaller goal. Like, okay, I'm gonna have a brief conversation with just one person and exchange contact info and celebrate those little moments of connection.
I like that. That sounds way more manageable than trying to be on for everyone in the room. Just focus on one small step.
Exactly.
So what's the second approach?
The second approach is about actively adjusting your attention bias. So that means making a real effort to direct your focus towards the other people you're interacting with. Pay attention to their expressions, their body language, even the mood of the conversation. When you do that, when you intentionally focus outwards, you actually become less consumed by your own self-consciousness and more engaged with what's going on around you.
Makes sense. You're sort of taking yourself out of the center of the equation.
Right.
So moving from feeling unseen to actually connecting with people, Li-Xuan Yang also talks about how to move beyond those really surface-level connections, those relationships. Why is it a problem to stay at that level?
Yeah, I mean, it's that really common experience, right, where you can chat with almost anyone about, the weather or current events, but you never really form those deeper bonds, the ones that are more meaningful. You might know a lot of people by name, but how many would you consider close friends or someone you could confide in?
Yeah, you can make small talk, but it never really seems to go beyond that. So how does he define this lack of deep connection?
Well, he describes someone who doesn't really share their life on a personal level. They don't really make an effort to connect with new people beyond those initial, pleasantries. They don't confide in their colleagues about anything that matters, and they don't even really remember or reach out to people from their past. It's just this pattern of shallow interactions without any real emotional investment or vulnerability.
Okay, so what are some of the traps that we fall into? Like what gets in the way of building those stronger bonds in the first place?
Well, he points to three main pitfalls. The first is self-centered communication. And this is when, you're mostly thinking about your own needs, your own feelings, and not really trying to see things from the other person's perspective. It also includes expressing yourself in ways that are just based on your mood without thinking about how it might affect other people.
So it's all about you. Okay, so what's the second communication trap?
The second one is coming across as overly perfect or guarded. So, you only share the positive things about yourself and your life, and it creates this sense of insincerity. People get the feeling that you're not being totally genuine or that you're hiding something. I mean, I remember in my own career early on, I would try so hard to present everything as totally flawless, and it actually made people trust me less. Have you noticed that?
Absolutely. It's like vulnerability can actually build trust, If someone seems like they always have it all together, it can come across as, inauthentic, a little fake even.
Right, exactly.
So what's the third trap? What's the third thing that keeps us at that surface level?
The third pitfall is a lack of proactive engagement. So that means not reaching out first, not sharing anything personal about your own life, and generally being more passive in your relationships, waiting for other people to reach out to you.
So it's kind of like waiting for things to happen instead of making them happen.
Yeah.
So how do we break through this? How do we go deeper and build something more meaningful?
Well, he offers three methods. One is to create this sort of mental portrait of the kind of deep connections you actually want to have. And he draws on the work of psychologist John Joseph Powell, who talked about these 5 levels of communication. There's cliches, there's facts, there's opinions, then feelings, and then empathy. And he encourages you to think about what level of depth you really want in your friendships.
Right.
And then manage your social relationships accordingly. So it's about being more intentional about the kind of connections you're actually trying to cultivate.
I like that idea of levels of connection. That's really helpful. So what's the second method he talks about?
The second is about increasing the depth of your interactions. And he stresses that, simply exchanging contact info, that's just the very beginning, right?
Right.
Building a real connection, it takes follow-up. You got to reach out again. You got to invest your time, share more about yourself, your interests, things like that. He also suggests reflecting on, how much you've gotten from past social activities, and that can help you decide, how to engage in the future.
Yeah, it's not just about like collecting context. It's about actually nurturing those relationships.
Exactly.
Okay, so what's the third way to move beyond those superficial connections?
The third method focuses on developing what are called strong ties with a core group of individuals. And here he refers to the concepts of strong and weak ties. That's a framework that was developed by the sociologist Mark Granovetter. So, your strong ties, think of them as your closest friends, your family, maybe colleagues you've shared a lot of experiences with, people you interact with often. And these relationships, they're characterized by, longer interaction times and often, a similar way of thinking. And investing in these close relationships, it gives you that foundation of deep connection and support.
So you're building that inner circle.
Right.
Okay, so we've explored, understanding social anxiety, overcoming invisibility, and building deeper connections. Now, Lee Swan Yang also discusses the importance of taking initiative in social interactions. He calls it ECAA3. Why is that so important to be more proactive?
Taking initiative is about, not just reacting to whatever's happening in a social situation. It's about being more in control, more empowered to shape the conversation, shape the interaction. Have you ever, wished you felt more in control in a social situation?
Oh, definitely. Sometimes, it feels like you're just kind of along for the ride, just reacting to whatever's happening.
Right.
So how do we actually do this? How do we take the lead? I know he breaks it down into 3 stages, right?
Yeah, so he divides the conversation into the beginning, the middle, and the end. And for beginning a conversation, one really key technique is grabbing attention. He tells this really interesting story about a young professor. He's starting his very first lecture, right? And instead of, jumping right in, he just stands silently at the front of the room. And he's writing these like tiny words on a huge blackboard. And of course, the students, they're immediately curious, they're engaged.
That's a great way to create intrigue, right? Just doing something unexpected.
Yeah.
So what's another way to start a conversation, especially with people you already know?
With people you already know, he suggests this method called, it translates to following the vine and bringing the gourd home. And basically it's about showing interest in what they're talking about, and then kind of skillfully guiding the conversation back to something you want to discuss. So you're kind of using their momentum to eventually get to your topic.
It's a way of steering the conversation more organically, right?
Yeah.
So what about conducting the conversation? Like once it's started, how do you keep it engaging and moving forward in a productive direction?
Okay, so the strategy here is really about understanding what the other person needs and then trying to provide value to the conversation. Active listening is essential, as is asking those clarifying questions, to really understand what they need. Like, for example, let's say you have a colleague who, keeps complaining about how long meetings are. Well, what they might really want is just, fewer meetings or more focused agendas.
So you're listening beyond the surface level. You're trying to figure out what their real desire is.
Exactly.
Now, Lee Swan Yang, he also mentions this thing called pseudo-complaints, right? Or yeah? What are those?
Yeah. Pseudo-complaints, that's when someone, expresses dissatisfaction, but the issue they're talking about isn't really the core of what's bothering them. And he identifies 5 kind of common motives for these. So it could be that they want attention, or they're trying to avoid responsibility, or they're subtly bragging about themselves, or they're trying to control the situation, or they're just making excuses. And recognizing these hidden motives can really help you respond in a more effective way.
Oh, that's so interesting. Like there's a whole layer underneath the complaint.
Right.
So lastly, how do we end a conversation well? Like how do you leave that positive impression and make people want to, connect again?
The key to ending well is to leave them feeling good about the interaction and maybe looking forward to connecting again in the future. And that could be something as simple as, it was great catching up, let's do this again soon, or maybe mentioning something specific that you plan to follow up on.
Yeah, ending on a high note. All right, so we've learned how to initiate, guide, and conclude a conversation, all with more intention. Now let's talk about working with others. Like Xuan Yang talks about cultivating cooperation or why. Why is this so important in our work lives, our personal lives?
Well, cooperation it's fundamental, right? I mean, in pretty much any area of life, whether it's work or if you're, doing your own thing, you rarely achieve anything truly significant totally on your own. Being able to work well with others, it's a cornerstone of success. I mean, wouldn't you agree?
Oh, 100%. Teamwork, collaboration. I mean, it's essential in so many areas of life. So how do we actually get people on board? How do we get colleagues, collaborators, willing to work together?
Well, he points to two key ways to foster cooperation, especially among colleagues. So the first one is about establishing your own position clearly and then expressing yourself, fully and confidently. So that means taking responsibility for your role, actively contributing your skills and your knowledge, showing that you're confident and professional in your interactions and sharing relevant information about yourself appropriately.
Yeah.
And he also points out that it's important not to rely on, just your seniority or your title to influence people to collaborate.
Right. So it's about being a valuable team member and making sure everyone feels like respected and heard.
Yeah.
So what's the second key element here?
The second one is building trust.
Yeah.
And that really boils down to being reliable in your actions. So, being on time for meetings, meeting your deadlines, giving thoughtful feedback. When people trust that you'll do what you say you'll do, they're much more likely to want to collaborate with you.
It all comes down to trust. I mean, that's the foundation of any strong working relationship, right?
Right.
Li Xuanyang, he also talks about managing upwards, which is, gaining the support of your superiors, those in more senior positions. What's important to keep in mind there?
He outlines three key aspects of managing upwards. First, it's about really understanding your supervisor's expectations. What are their priorities? What are their goals for the team? What's their preferred way of working? Second, it's about inspiring them with a positive and proactive attitude, showing that you're enthusiastic, taking initiative. That can be really influential. And third, it's crucial to take ownership of your work and your results and not make excuses when things don't go as planned.
So it's about understanding their perspective, being a positive force, and taking responsibility.
Right.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about personal boundaries. Li Xuanyang discusses understanding and maintaining social boundaries, or why is this so important? Why do we need clear boundaries?
Having healthy social boundaries, it's essential. It's how you protect your time, your energy, even your well-being when you're, interacting with other people. When your boundaries get crossed, whether it's, someone sharing private info without your consent, or maybe you're constantly being asked for favors that you just don't have the capacity for, it can lead to resentment, burnout, all sorts of negative feelings. Have you ever felt taken advantage of?
Oh, for sure. And it's easy for people to overstep if you haven't made those boundaries clear in the first place. And Li Xuanyang points out that that when those boundaries are unclear, people start taking your help for granted. How do we prevent that?
Well, the book presents two main approaches to managing social boundaries. The first is setting what he calls forbidden zones based on self-reflection. So Veji A. So basically, it's thinking about what you're personally sensitive about and then assuming that other people might have similar sensitivities. And then you adjust your behavior accordingly. And you also become more aware of when other people might be crossing those boundaries, even if you haven't explicitly stated them. It's about starting from this place of, mutual respect for personal space, both physical and emotional.
So it's like projecting your own sense of what's appropriate onto other people as a starting point.
Right.
So what's the second method for managing those boundaries?
The second method is learning to say no, effectively and appropriately. So, clearly stating that you're not able to help with a request, taking the time to understand, why they're asking. So maybe you can offer alternative solutions, being tactful, and even using specific phrases like, I don't have time for that right now.
Yeah.
He even quotes the child psychologist Donald Woods Winnicott, who said, say yes wholeheartedly, say no gently and firmly, which I think really captures the essence of setting good boundaries.
That's a good one. Say yes wholeheartedly. Say no gently and firmly.
Yeah.
Okay, Li Xuanyang, he also introduces this concept of a social boundary circuit breaker. What's that all about? What's he talking about there?
So think of it like a safety switch, When you feel your boundaries being tested or crossed, this circuit breaker is a way to pause the interaction. It gives you a moment to, to step back emotionally, assess what's happening, and then you can come up with a more thoughtful response. You're not reacting in the heat of the moment or feeling pressured to say yes to something you don't want to do.
Oh, that's a great tool. It's like hitting the pause button so you can regroup.
Exactly.
Now, conflict, I mean, it's inevitable, right? We all encounter disagreements. So, Li Shuangyang talks about resolving conflicts, or it's Adori. What are some of his suggestions for handling those disagreements constructively?
So interpersonal conflict, as he explains it, it's this psychological process that comes up when we perceive differences in our goals, our beliefs, our values.
Hmm.
And and that often leads to disappointment and a breakdown of trust. A really common example in the workplace is conflict over how resources are allocated, who gets what. And he also touches on those natural fight or flight responses that we have to conflict, which are, linked to more primitive parts of our brain. You might have heard of the triune brain theory.
Yeah, so our initial reactions to conflicts, they're not always helpful.
Not always.
So how do we move beyond those knee-jerk reactions and actually, work towards resolving things?
Well, he offers two main approaches. First is focusing on managing emotions. And he emphasizes that addressing the emotional aspects of the conflict, that should be the priority, even before trying to solve the actual problem.
Yeah.
It's about separating your feelings from the facts of the situation. And he uses this analogy called the South Wind Law, which comes from one of Aesop's fables, where gentle persuasion is more effective than harsh force.
Hmm.
And he also suggests, just cooling down or taking a break, letting those emotions settle before having a more rational conversation.
So it's deal with the feelings first, let everyone calm down, and then you can get into the specifics.
Right.
So what's the second key?
The second key is precise expression. So that means, being careful not to bring up old grievances, watching your language, not using harsh words or accusations, sticking to the issue at hand, and practicing what's called empathetic listening, where you're really trying to understand the other person's perspective. And he highlights the value of using I statements to express your feelings. So, for example, you would say, I feel frustrated when, instead of, you always make me frustrated.
Yeah, it's about taking ownership of your own feelings and not blaming the other person. So clear communication, empathy, those are key. Liz Swanyang also he kind of sums up a few key attitudes that are important for handling conflict, right?
Yeah, he highlights four important attitudes. So approaching the conflict, wanting to actually solve the problem, sticking to the current issues, expressing yourself clearly and calmly, and then viewing conflict as an opportunity for growth, not just as a negative event, but as a chance to, learn and grow emotionally and to even strengthen the relationship.
That's a really healthy way to look at conflict. I like that. Now, let's think about how we present ourselves, in social situations. Like Swan Yang discusses defining your social role, or why is this important? Why do we need to think about our role?
Well, having a clear understanding of your social role is important for, building those harmonious and effective relationships. When you know what value you bring to interactions and how you uniquely contribute, you can connect with others more authentically, more confidently.
So it's about knowing your strengths and how you kind of fit into the whole social dynamic, right?
Yeah.
So how do we go about actually defining our social role? What does Li Shuanyang suggest we do?
Okay, he encourages a bit of self-reflection. What's your inherent value? What are your strengths? What are your, unique characteristics?